You were never meant to hear this story. Not from me, not from anyone. The records were sealed, the names scrubbed, the truth buried in stone and shadow, but it happened, and someone knew it would happen again. The night of October 23rd, 1965, the village of Ashworth, Yorkshire, was wrapped in a fog so thick you could taste the iron in the air. Time itself slowed down like the land remembered. Something terrible. The bell in St. Mary's Tower rang. Not on the hour, not by human hands, it rang once long and hollow, like a warning sent up from the soil. Those who heard it described pressure in their chest, like being watched by something buried, not something living. Then the Higgins family disappeared. Not just missing, not just gone, they were erased. Scrubbed from memory, from record. From time itself, their cottage untouched. The kettle still warm, a chessboard with 2 moves left unfinished. Their beds turned down for a night that never came. No signs of panic. No struggle, just a vacuum of presence, a silence that screamed. For 72 hours, no one said a word, not out of fear, but because something had made them forget. And then she remembered Miss Allerton, the schoolteacher, asked why the children were not in class, why the morning post was never delivered, why the church doors hung open against a windless dawn. By dusk a village gathered outside the Higgins home, staring in confusion as if waking from someone else's dream, but this was no dream. This was a breach. Inside, everything felt off wrong, not in what you could see, but what you could feel. The walls were still the books untouched, but the silence was wrong, heavy, deliberate. A Bible lay open on the dining table, but the page was burned as if touched by fire that came from inside the paper. The word inheritance was written across the parlor wall, not in ink or chalk. In something slick and red, lantern light made it shimmer like blue. D. Remembering, the constable, Robert Henley, wrote his report. But the report never made it to archives. It vanished because someone had been waiting for it, because the Higgins family were not random, they were marked. They were bound to a lineage that predated England itself, and the rituals beneath St. Mary's had never ended. They had only gone quiet. What lay beneath that church was not a grave, it was an altar. And someone in that family had touched it. They built the church on top of something they could not name. They said it was to consecrate the ground to bless what was once pagan, but what they really did was trap it, bind it, feed it slowly over centuries with prayer and silence and blood. St. Mary's was never a house of God. It was a vault, a seal. And the Higgins family lived closer to it than anyone else in the village. Their cottage stood less than 50 yards from the oldest part of the church, the northern transept, where no weddings were held, where no funerals were conducted, where no one sat during Sunday service, because the villagers knew without knowing. Something was watching from there, something that remembered. When the fog rolled in that October, it wasn't weather, it was memory. Memory bleeding through cracks in the old stone. That fog wasn't cold, it was old, and the Higgins family began to change. The boy Billy started drawing symbols he had never been taught. Circles within circles, spirals, keys, doors. The girl, Margaret, stopped speaking for hours at a time, and would only answer questions in Latin. No one had ever taught her Latin, not in that village, not in that school. And Elenina, the mother, she began to hum songs no one recognized, melodies that made the birds go silent. She walked barefoot in the garden long past midnight, speaking to shadows that had no shape. And Thomas, the father, he stopped sleeping altogether. He began recording things, pages upon pages of observations. He wrote about rhythms in the earth, about voices in the church walls. He believed the bells had stopped marking time and had begun counting something else. And he was right, because when the church was built in 1187, the foundation stones were placed around something already buried, something not human, not dead, something waiting. Thomas found it, or it found him. And 3 weeks before the family disappeared, he began writing in code. The final entries in his journal were scratched into the margins with what looked like bone. They told of a passage beneath the church, a sealed room, a place only opened once every 5 generations. And that time had come. The constable said the journal was nonsense. The church refused to acknowledge it existed, but the librarian, Margaret Thornton, had seen the symbols before. In a book she was ordered never to show anyone. A book wrapped in lambskin, locked in a drawer, sealed by 3 wax sigils. One of them matched the drawing Billy had carved into the wall of his classroom. The book was not listed in any catalog. It bore no title, no author, no date, only a sigil pressed deep into its skin like something not written but summoned. It had been passed down through the Thornton bloodline, guarded, not read, kept, not studied, a relic too dangerous for thought. And yet it called to those marked by lineage, by proximity, by accident, or by design. When Margaret Thornton opened it for the first time in 40 years, her hands shook. The pages felt warm, and the ink smelled like old rain inside. She found a map, a layout of the church. Not as it was now, but as it had once been beneath the sanctuary. A circular chamber with 7 niches carved into the wall and 1 stone altar at the center, each niche marked with a name. None of them English. One of them, Higgins, she did not sleep that night. She returned the book to the drawer, resealed the wax, and placed a crucifix atop it. But the dreams came anyway, of voices speaking in chords, not words, of eyes without faces watching her from behind glass, of stone bleeding. Meanwhile, the investigation was being buried. Officially, the Higgins family had fled. Unofficially, they were a problem being managed. But Henley the constable couldn't let it go. He had seen the inside of the church cellar, and what he found didn't match the blueprints. There was a door, small, arched, made of blackened wood and reinforced with bands of iron older than the English language. There was no keyhole, no hinges. Only 7 indentations surrounding a circular depression in the center. It was a seal, and it was warm. Henley brought the Reverend. Whitmore did not speak. He only stared at it and whispered something under his breath, a phrase Henley remembered only because it made the air move. The Reverend left the cellar and ordered it sealed, but Henley went back alone the next night, and he heard them voices, dozens, some laughing, some chanting, some pleading, and one that spoke directed, fly, to him. It said the Higgins name. It said the altar had been fed, but not completed, that something was still required. And then silence. When Henley looked again, the door was gone, the wall smooth, the room empty. He went home and poured whiskey until the bottle was dry, and in the morning he filed no report. He went to Margaret Thornton and asked her for the book. Margaret did not hesitate. She unlocked the drawer, cut the wax with a silver blade, and placed the book between them. Without speaking, the air in the room grew heavier, as if the walls themselves leaned closer. The moment Henley opened the book, the lamp flickered twice, then went dark. Not broken, just dimmed like something didn't want light inside. The pages felt alive. They turned slower, then his hands moved, resisting him, pulling back and then settling like a beast, finding comfort in a new handler. Henley found the names again. He traced his finger across the one marked Higgins, the ink burned cold. Next to each name was a date and a symbol. The date next to Higgins matched the autumn of 1965. The symbol. A spiral broken at the base. He saw it again and again throughout the book, on the margins, on the altar drawings, on diagrams of the human body that made no anatomical sense. The spiral, broken. He asked Margaret what it meant. She answered only once. It's not a map, it's an opening. Henley left the book and returned to the church that night alone. He brought with him the lantern and the journal he had taken from the Higgins cottage. He descended into the cellar, but the door was back. It had returned. This time it was breathing. Not visibly, but the air pulsed near it like a second heartbeat. Henley touched the central depression, and for a moment his mind collapsed inward. He saw things, not dreams, not memories, but warnings, an ocean of fire beneath stone, a wheel of limbs and wings and teeth spinning through black wind. A child speaking backward while holding a book with no pages, and behind it all, a figure tall, shrouded in robes that flickered between centuries, a mask made of 3 faces and its hand extended offering Henley the same spiral he had seen in the journal. When he came back to himself, he was standing outside the church, no memory of leaving, the journal gone, the lantern shattered. Only the spiral remained, drawn into the dirt at his feet with something red and warm. It was still wet. He looked up, and the church bell rang, but not from above, from below. And in that moment Henley understood. The church was not protecting the village, it was feeding it. The next morning, the village felt different, not visibly, not outwardly, but at a level just beneath sensation. The dogs would not bark, the birds had gone silent, and the children spoke softer, as if they were being listened to by something that wasn't meant to listen. Henley did not report for duty that day or the next. His uniform was found folded on the steps of St. Mary's, the buttons aligned, the boots polished, the badge resting atop a piece of paper torn from the Higgins journal. It bore only one line. We opened it. And beneath that, a symbol. The broken spiral. Mrs. Thornton locked the library that week without explanation, but those who passed by swore they saw her inside, speaking to no one, whispering phrases in dead languages, her hands moving over books as if in prayer or penance, and every night the same figure stood in the shadows of the graveyard watching the church-long coat, tall frame, wide-brimmed hat. No one approached it because everyone already knew it wasn't there to be spoken to, it was there to be obeyed. Then came the frost, earlier than ever before. It killed the crops in a single night, left a layer of ice inside the schoolhouse windows, and turned the water in the baptismal font to something black. On the 3rd week after the Higgins disappearance, the church bells stopped entirely, but everyone still heard them, from the ground, from the walls, from their sleep, and always 3 tones, low, lower, gone. Then Margaret Rose was seen again, near the northern transept. Her eyes were open, but her face was blank like a porcelain mask. She was humming, The same song her mother had hummed, the song no one could place, a rhythm that felt circular, like walking into a room you've never seen but somehow remember. She did not speak. She did not blink. And she left behind only her notebook. Inside were the headstone rubbings, but altered. Names had changed, dates reversed, symbols added. And every page bore a single phrase in a looping, childlike hand. The altar sleeps, but the altar knows. Reverend Whitmore collected the notebook and never spoke of it again. That Sunday he gave no sermon. Instead, he lit 13 candles, turned to the congregation, and said only this: "You were told it was a church. It was never a church. It was a threshold. And we crossed it." No one spoke after the Reverend's words. The candles flickered, but were not moved by wind. The stained glass no longer showed saints or apostles. It reflected only shadow shapes that stretched longer than the sun should allow. The congregation sat, frozen eyes wide, hands clenched, knees trembling, not from fear, but from recognition, because something in them had always known what the church truly was. They had passed it every day, prayed beneath its tower, baptized their children at its altar. But beneath every prayer there had been something listening, something ancient, something hungry. And now it was awake. That night 13 families in Ashworth did not sleep. The old families, the ones whose names appeared in the forbidden book. Thornton, Carr, Whitlock. Each received a letter, no stamp, no sender, sealed with red wax and the broken spiral, inside only a date and a location. Below St. Mary's, at the hour of the 13th bell, they gathered without speaking, without question, because they had been trained to obey. It was not ritual, it was obligation. They brought no torches, no tools, only memory and blood. Reverend Whitmore led them down the hidden stairwell behind the organ, a place no choir boy had ever seen, a staircase that had not been used in 3 generations. At the bottom, a door made of stone. It did not open. It receded like a mouth preparing to speak. Inside was not a room. It was a circle of stone lined with niches, 7 in total, and in the center the altar, no carvings, no cross, only the spiral. And it pulsed. Each family placed something into the altar. A tooth, a lock of hair, a page from an unspoken book. Not offerings, keys. When the 7th key was placed, the altar opened. Not physically, but inward, reality folded like paper, and in the center stood the Higgins family, eyes closed, bodies still, hands bound in a chain of herbs and ash. They were not alive, but they were not dead. They were waiting, and he altar whispered, not in sound, but in memory. It showed each of the 13 their part in the old agreement, the covenant made long before England, when ash was still bone, when stone was still flesh, and it asked only one thing: choose who returns and who remains. No vote was taken. No words were exchanged. The decision had already been made before they entered the room. The old families did not operate by debate. They moved through obedience, through legacy, through necessity. Thomas Higgins would remain the father, the watcher, the one who broke the seal, the one who knew too much. He had written the glyphs in bone. He had traced the spiral backward. He had touched the altar with intent. He was no longer a man, he was a vessel. Elelonina was chosen to return, not out of mercy, but purpose. She remembered the old ways. She spoke the names of herbs in the dead tongue. She kept a garden grown from memory, and she could teach. She would raise the next. Margaret and William were different. Margaret carried the map in her blood. She did not just read the book, she heard it. Pages spoke to her in dreams. Symbols danced behind her eyes. She saw through time. She could not be allowed to leave, but she was not to remain. She would be kept, guarded, prepared. Billy was the key, too young to understand, too pure to resist. He saw without distortion, drew without filter. His sketches were prophecy in crayon, and they needed him on the outside. He would walk among the unaware until the signs returned, until the spiral opened again. At the edge of the chamber, the Reverend whispered the rite. 13 voices followed, the altar responded, light without source poured from the spiral, soft, blinding, cold. When it dimmed, only 3 remained in the circle Elelonina, Billy and the Reverend. The rest had vanished, or become something else. They emerged at dawn. The villagers said nothing, only watched as the boy clutched his mother's hand, eyes hollow, lips silent. Behind them, the church bell rang once, low and final. Billy never spoke again. Elelonina walked with a limp that no doctor could explain. And the Reverend, he was no longer the same man. His sermons stopped. He began painting, strange, violent canvas, us that he never showed. He nailed shut the northern transept, covered every mirror in the rectory. And every week he descended beneath the church, to stand before the altar and listen because it still whispered, and what it said was getting louder. The year turned and Ashworth changed in ways no one could name. The fog came earlier, lingered longer. The animals grew restless, cows would not enter the northern fields, dogs refused to walk past the church doors. Even the insects seemed to avoid the walls of St. Mary's, like they remembered what humans could not. The spiral began to appear, carved into trees, etched into frost, drawn by children, who claimed they had seen it in their dreams, and always it was broken, the break at the base, the fracture that meant opening. Billy carried it with him. Not in his hands, but behind his eyes. He no longer laughed, no longer played. He sat for hours at a time watching corners, listening to cracks in the wall. He drew in silence, and every drawing was the same, the altar, the niches, the faces of those who were taken but distorted, eyes too wide, mouths sewn shut, and a 13th face unfinished because it had not yet arrived. Elelonina began writing again, journals, dozens of them, filled with herbs, rituals, dates. She said it was for Billy to protect him. But the things she wrote were not protective, they were summoning. Recipes in forgotten languages, instructions for shaping clay that did not dry, symbols that must never be spoken aloud, and always, at the bottom of each page, a warning. Do not break the spiral. She wore a pendant now, silver, carved with the same mark. And she warned anyone who visited, do not touch it. Never speak its name. Never ask about the altar. No one did, because those who did dreamed things they could not forget. Mrs. Peaton, the old neighbor, asked once. She woke with soil under her fingernails and a spiral burned into her floor. She never spoke again, Reverend Whitmore no longer led services, but he remained. He wandered to the graveyard at night, hands behind his back, humming the same song Elena once hummed, the one without a name. He painted symbols on the church walls, then covered them, painted over, fire them again, but they always returned, because the church was remembering, and the altar was not sleeping, it was counting. And when the count reached 13, it would open again. It always does. It began with the birds. First, small things, the kind no one counts, sparrows, blackbirds, finches. They fell from the sky in perfect silence, no cries, no struggle, just sudden stillness, like their wings had forgotten what they were made for. The villagers found them in patterns around the churchyard, shaped like the spiral, unbroken yet incomplete. Then came the dreams. They spread through the village without warning. Old men woke weeping, unable to speak. Young children stared at the moon and whispered numbers. 13, always 13. And one woman, Agnes Elwood, walked into the moors barefoot at midnight and was found days later standing in the ruins of an ancient stone circle, eyes closed, mouth open, as if waiting to be filled. She had drawn the spiral into the earth, over and over, until her fingers bled. The doctor said it was exhaustion, but Dr. Carr knew better. He examined her eyes and found something moving behind the retina. Not natural, not human, like it was looking out, watching. The church bell rang again. No one touched the rope. No one climbed the tower. But it rang, one long note, and then silence. Inside the church, a Bible had been placed on the altar, open to Revelation, but the text was altered, not printed, carved, as if someone had replaced the words with something older, something not meant to be read aloud. Whitmore found it first. He did not touch it. He knelt before it and whispered the names of the families, every one, and wept. Because he understood what was coming and what was required, across the village symbols began to appear, on windows, on doors, burned into wooden beams, scratched beneath doormats, always the same. The spiral, broken at the base, Reverend Whitmore summoned the 13, or what remained of them. Some had vanished, some had died, others refused the call. They met beneath the church one final time, and this time the altar did not wait for offerings. It spoke, not with voice, but with a sense, a pressure that cracked the walls, bent the candlelight, and filled their lungs with something that felt like drowning. It said one thing. It is not enough. Another must open. And then the light returned. But none of them remembered how they had left the room, only that their hands were stained and one of the names was missing from the book. The village of Ashworth was sealed within itself, not by fence, not by law, but by something far older. No one came in and no one left without permission, not official permission. Something else, the spiral had stretched its roots and the town bent to its shape. Trains passed without stopping. Letters went unanswered. Even the air felt thicker, like every breath was borrowed. Billy had stopped speaking completely now, but not out of fear. It was as if his mouth belonged to something else. He would stare for hours at blank walls, then suddenly pick up charcoal and draw, scenes no one had seen, yet everyone recognized. A room without walls, a mouth in the ground, a woman made of crows. His final drawing, before the Reverend burned the sketchbook, was of the altar, but split open. Inside was not blood, not bone, but light, blinding, and from it a shadow crawled. Elena grew weaker by the day. She said the soil had turned. The herbs no longer obeyed, even the dead would not stay where they were buried. One morning she found footprints in the garden, small, bare, but burned into the frost. She wept and poured salt across the doorstep, then wrote in her journal, "He is returning." Meanwhile, the Reverend had stopped pretending. He no longer wore his collar, no longer addressed the congregation. He spoke only to Billy, in the old tongue, in symbols, in dreams. They began preparing the altar again, washing it, feeding it, teaching it. They placed objects on it, not relics, not offerings, but reminders. A child's tooth, a jar of dead wasps, a mirror cracked down the center, and a single silver spoon engraved with a name no one would say aloud. The altar accepted them. It pulsed, not visibly, but felt, through floorboards, through walls, through the teeth of every man, woman, and child in Ashworth. It was no longer a symbol, it was awake. And counting again, the spiral had closed. Now it would open in reverse, and those who had kept the silence, would Luddy be first to hear the scream, because the 13th was returning, not from death but from beyond, and he would not come alone. The veil that kept Ashworth tethered to the world began to thin. It wasn't immediate. It happened in the way mirrors sometimes catch things that aren't behind you, in the way a hallway feels longer at night. Time bent, clocks disagreed, days melted into each other. And the sky, it turned wrong. Not red, not stormed, but bruised. The moon hovered low and unmoving, as if staring, as if waiting for a signal the altar had changed. Those who passed it, even briefly, heard whispers in their own voice, but not in their language, and not of anything they remembered. One of the last remaining 13, Jonathan Reed, tried to flee. He made it as far as the tree line. They found his boots a mile out, neatly placed as if he'd stepped out of them mid-stride, and carved into the soil between them, the spiral, not drawn, not etched, but sunk, as if the earth had collapsed inward. They sealed the church after that, boarded it, nailed crosses to the doors, lit a fire circle around its base. But the boards rotted in hours, the crosses cracked, and the fire refused to burn. The altar did not like to be ignored. Elena told them the truth then, told them what she had hidden. The altar had never been built. It had been uncovered, long before the church, long before the village. It had been waiting, sleeping in the soil like a heartbeat under stone. The first settlers felt it, called it sacred, built their lives around it, but always gave it room to breathe. It was the new priests, the 13, that woke it, with their chants, with their blood, with the vow they never understood. She told them that Billy was not just a child, he was the mirror, a vessel, and the 13th wasn't coming for him. It was coming through him. That's why he no longer spoke, because the voice inside him wasn't ready. But it would be soon. Very soon. And when it spoke, the world they knew would fold like paper soaked in oil. The town forgot how to sleep, not from fear, but because sleep itself stopped coming. People would lie in bed, eyes open, hours passing without dreams, only static behind their eyelids, as if the mind refused to let go, as if something was waiting in the dark to enter. When they closed their eyes, they began to forget things, little things first, the names of neighbors, where the road ended, what month it was, but then deeper things like how their parents had died, or why they had children, or what language they were supposed to be speaking. Whole families stood in kitchens, silent, unmoving, mouthing words with no sound, trying to remember who they were because the altar was eating memory. One thought at a time, Billy was drawing again, but not on paper. He carved into the walls, into the floor, into his own arms, the spiral over and over, but never finished, always missing a turn, as if he was waiting for someone to complete it. The Reverend watched him like a guardian, but also like a prisoner. He had stopped aging. His hair remained black, his skin pale, but his eyes, they had begun to glow. Not with light, but with depth, as if you could fall into them and never return. Elelanena gathered the remaining villagers, those who could still speak, still think, and she told them the old name, the one that came before the altar, before the priests, before the Bible. She whispered it, and the air thickened. Some began to bleed from the ears, others fell to the floor, limbs seizing. One woman laughed until her ribs cracked. The name wasn't for humans, it was meant for the stone, meant to unlock something deep beneath the town, and it had. Because the earth began to hum, not a sound, but a vibration. A low tremor that never stopped, like the land itself was breathing, or remembering. The church bell rang again, but this time it was inside every house, every skull, every thought. The 13th was almost here, and the altar was building a path, not of wood, not of stone, but of minds, of memory, of flesh. It began with the sound of glass, not shattering, but folding, as if windows were being bent inward by invisible hands. One by one, panes across Ashworth melted, leaving puddles on the floor. But they weren't made of glass anymore. They pulsed, like organs torn from something still breathing. The villagers stopped moving, mid-sentence, mid-thought. Mid-step, their mouths open. But no sound came out. They were listening. All of them. Even the dogs froze in place. Even the trees seemed to tilt toward the church, toward the altar, toward what was coming. Billy stood at the center of it all. His body was still, but the shadows around him began to move, not like flame, not like smoke, but like hands. Hundreds of them, reaching from the floor, the ceiling, the cracks in the walls, each one pointing to the altar. The Reverend knelt beside it. He didn't pray, he didn't speak. He simply opened his mouth and let the blood pour out. It wasn't his, it was black. It steamed, and it sang. A low note, not audible but felt. Like a secret you had always known but never wanted to admit. Elelanena screamed for Billy, not in fear but in grief, she knew. It wasn't him anymore. Not fully, the spiral on his chest began to move. It turned, one direction, then the other, and with that the ground beneath the altar split. Not cracked, split, cleanly, like a wound being reopened. And from the opening rose the 13th. He wore no form, he was not flesh, but memory, wrapped in shadow, a tall figure with no face, only a mirror. And in that mirror, each villager saw their true self, not who they were, but what they were meant to become. Most screamed, some collapsed. One man clawed out his own eyes. But Billy did not move because Billy saw nothing. The mirror showed only black. The 13th stepped from the altar's wound, and pointed to the Reverend not to destroy, but to kneel. And he did, silently, willfully, like he had always known. This was the moment he was born for, and then the altar spoke, not with words, but with memory. And everyone remembered what they were never meant to know. It started in the post office. Letters stopped arriving. Then the mailboxes themselves disappeared. Not stolen, not broken, just gone. Even the slots in the doors were sealed smooth as if they'd never existed. A boy tried to call his uncle in Chicago. There was no dial tone, there was no cord, there was no phone. When he asked his mother about it, she stared at him, confused. "What's a phone?" she whispered, and burst into tears because she didn't know why she was crying. Then the maps changed. First in the schoolhouse, then the courthouse, then in the minds of the people who had once traveled through Ashworth. It was erased, quietly, efficiently, like the town had been a clerical error in history. Even the birds stopped flying over it. The sky above turned an endless gray. No clouds, no sun, just an indifferent ceiling of stillness. And yet the altar remained, alive, hungry, feeding on every forgotten thing. Billy wandered the streets barefoot, the spiral on his chest glowing faintly beneath his shirt. Children followed him, wordless, expressionless, as if they were being pulled by invisible thread. Their parents didn't notice, or didn't care, or didn't remember having children. Alila Nena clutched her journal, but the ink was vanishing from its pages. She tried to rewrite what she knew, but the pen would not move. The paper refused to hold memory. She screamed at the sky, but there was no echo. The Reverend stood in the church window staring out, not watching, just waiting. Waiting for the rest to be unmade, because the altar wasn't finished. It had consumed the town's memory. Now it was feeding on existence itself, not with fire, not with force, but with forgetting. And in the nearby cities, people began to feel a strange emptiness, a sense they had misplaced something important, but they couldn't name it, couldn't locate it on a map, couldn't even describe what it had once been. Ashworth was becoming myth, then rumor, then silence. And soon, only the altar would remember, and it would remember everything. Long before Ashworth, before the state, before the settlers, the altar was there, buried, half a mile beneath the roots of the oldest tree, covered in stone, older than language. The Lenape tribes avoided that land. They spoke of a wound in the world, a place where dreams turned to ash and time moved backwards. They built no fires there. No footsteps were allowed to touch it. Even the animals steered clear. But then came the men with maps and books and steel tools. They thought it was just soil, just rock. They thought they could tame it, so they dug. And on the 13th day, their shovels struck something cold, something that rang like bone when touched. They unearthed it, cleaned it, admired its strange angles, its impossible design. 12 sides, each with markings no scholar could read, and at its center, a spiral that moved when no one was watching. They thought it was sacred, but not in the way they believed. They built the church around it, to protect it, to control it. But you don't control a thing like that. You awaken it. And once it wakes, it does not sleep again. Over the years, the ground warped. Maps had to be redrawn. Stars above it shifted. Time inside the town moved slower or faster or sideways. No one noticed at first, because forgetting is how the altar feeds. And every generation one child would be born under a moonless sky, eyes darker than night, hands that trembled around mirrors. And always the spiral. Somewhere on their body, Billy was not the first, but he was the last, because the altar was nearing its final shape, and through him it would speak. Nena found the last journal entry of a midwife from 1791. It read, "The boy is wrong. He cries before he's born. His eyes are open. The spiral on his back, it whispers." And beneath that, one final sentence, barely legible. We should never have built over it. The altar was not made. The altar was waiting. The townspeople gathered without knowing why, at the edge of the chapel green, drawn by a pole they couldn't name, some in robes, some barefoot, some still wearing the faces of the lives they'd lived, but no longer remembering what those lives were. Time had collapsed into something soft. And all roads led here to Billy, who now stood atop the altar, arms at his side, eyes closed, the spiral on his chest glowing like coal. The Reverend knelt below him, mouth sewn shut with a thread of shadow, a sacrifice willingly offered. Then Billy opened his mouth and spoke, but the voice was not his. It had no accent, no age. It was not made for human throats. The sound curled through the air and carved itself into the minds of everyone present. A name, 7 syllables long, unutterable, unwritable but understood. It was the town's true name, not Ashworth, not any word men had used, but the name it was given before time was counted, a name that echoed through memory and cracked every false belief they had ever held. The cobblestones bled, trees bent backwards, roots exposed to the sky, and the spiral began to spread. Not just across Billy's skin, but across the ground, the buildings, the people, each swirl a sentence, each curve a command. Some tried to run, but the sky collapsed inward, and the horizon folded like a paper cage. There was no outside anymore. Only the altar, only the spiral, only the truth. Nena tried to write it down, but her fingers turned to glass. Each letter she tried to form shattered in her bones. Still, she remembered, because that was the point. The altar wasn't trying to destroy the town, it was restoring it to what it had always been, a vessel, a passage, a mouth in the earth. And Billy was its tongue. When he spoke again, the houses bowed, the earth cracked, the chapel windows wept tears of ink, and every man, woman, and child heard the same message. You were never alive. You were only the dream. I am the waking. The altar did not kill. It selected, one by one people began to vanish, not with screams, not with struggle, just faded, a flicker, a breath, and gone. No hash, no echo, not even dust where they once stood. Only the faint scent of old parchment, and the spiral etched faintly into the floor. The ones who remained knew. Though no words were spoken, they were being judged. By memory, by will, by what they carried inside, because the altar didn't crave death, it craved endurance. The ability to hold truth without breaking, to remember in a world built to forget. Nena, still trembling, watched as her mother disappeared mid-sentence, one moment braiding her hair, the next just fingers in the air, reaching for something that no longer existed. Then she herself was tested. The spiral appeared beneath her feet, glowing, turning, whispering, "Name your sin." She could not speak. The words caught in her throat, but she remembered the night she saw Billy at the altar and chose to run. Not warn the others, not stop him, just escape, because fear had lived in her bones longer than faith, and the altar knew. It whispered again, "Memory is the price. Offer yours." She collapsed, tears pouring from her eyes, not out of grief, but because she knew what it meant. She would forget her brother, her father, her name, but she would live. And so the spiral turned once more, accepted the offering, and passed her by. Others were not so fortunate. The baker who denied the hunger, the sheriff who buried the bones behind the schoolhouse, the choir boy who saw too much gone. Gone, gone. Billy stood unmoved, the spiral now spreading from his chest down both arms like vines made of black light. The reverend, still kneeling, nodded without moving his head as if he too knew what was coming. Because the town had crossed a threshold, it was no longer part of history. It was a ritual, a living manuscript, and the altar was writing its final chapter, in blood and silence and unbearable truth. The town had no clocks anymore. Time had shattered. The sun blinked in and out. Shadows no longer followed their owners. Some cried, some prayed, but most just obeyed, because now the spiral was everywhere, branded into doors, burned into the sky, etched into the skin of infants not yet born. The altar was not content with devotion. It wanted structure. It wanted discipline. It wanted order. So it began to assign roles. Each survivor heard it in their sleep, a voice made of dust and thunder. You are the keeper of echoes. You are the devourer of names. You are the mouth that does not speak. Tasks with no logic, no explanation, but refusal meant erasure, and so they obeyed, without question, without pause. One woman was told to gather feathers from birds that had never flown. Another was commanded to whisper to the walls for 13 hours a day. They did it, tears running down their cheeks because the spiral fed not just on belief but on obedience to madness. And still it grew. The chapel's bell tower inverted itself, ringing downward into the earth. The altar sank 2 feet, then rose 4, its geometry now impossible to describe, more sides than space should allow. It was becoming something else. Billy now hovered inches above its surface. Eyes gone milky, mouth forever open, but no sound escaped, only the spiral spinning across his tongue. Faster each hour, the reverend stood nearby, now fully blind, but smiling, because he understood he had been chosen not to preach, but to translate. He began writing in a language no man had ever seen. Long spirals on pages of stretched skin, the altar's commands made flesh, and still the people followed. They rebuilt the school as a shrine, gutted the town hall to make room for the spiral's root. Each action dictated by symbols, dreams, blood on the floor that formed words, and all of it leading toward one goal. A moment, a singular point in time when the altar would open and the town would no longer be part of this world. But something beyond it, something beneath it. The altar did not want worshippers, it wanted servants. And it had found them. She found it in silence, not with shouting, not with light, but with a tremor beneath her feet. Nena had been cleaning the chapel floors as commanded. scrubbing spirals she no longer questioned. Hands cracked, knees raw, when the stone beneath the altar breathed. Yes, breathed, just once. A slow inhale, then stillness. She leaned down, heart pounding, and saw it, a crack, small, perfect, breathing. Driven by something older than courage, she pried it open. Her fingers bled. The crack widened. Stone gave way to earth, and beneath the altar, buried in red cloth bound with human hair, lay the original manuscript. Not the Reverend's translations, not the spiraled echoes etched in flesh, but the first prophecy, old paper, ink like dried blood. Words written by the first voice, the one that came before Billy, before the Reverend, before even the town. She unwrapped it, hands trembling, eyes weeping before reading a word. It began with 7 words. This is not a prophecy. It is a warning. The next line struck like a knife. The altar does not grant power. It consumes potential. And then, he who speaks for the spiral is already dead. Alela Nena dropped the parchment. She tried to scream, but her voice was gone. Stolen, traded, perhaps, or silenced by the spiral itself. But she kept reading. She had to. The manuscript was alive. The letters pulsed with heat. Each word burned into her eyes, so she could never forget, even if her tongue could never say them. It told the origin of the altar. Not divine, not holy. It was a wound, a tear in the fabric of memory, a place where forgotten things bled through, where voices once silenced were allowed to speak. But not all voices were meant to return. The altar, the prophecy said, was not a test. It was a reset. A spiral meant to unravel history itself, to erase every lie ever told, every illusion, every name. It ended with a final sentence. If the spiral completes itself, time will end, but memory will remain. Screaming, she dropped the scroll. The altar pulsed, and Billy turned his head toward her for the first time in days and smiled. Because now, she knew, she didn't sleep that night. None of them did, but for Alela Nena, it wasn't fear that kept her awake. It was clarity, like the sky had been scraped clean, like she was finally seeing what the altar had always been, a mirror, not for the body, not even for the mind, but for truth itself. She stepped into the church at midnight. No candles, no moon. The altar glowed from within, as if something inside it was waking up. Billy hovered above it. Silent. His limb too long now. His skin stretched like paper. His mouth no longer a mouth, but a gate. And from that gate, the spiral poured, endless, rotating, hungry. The Reverend knelt beside the altar, hands lifted, whispering in a tongue that bled from the ears to hear. But Aliyanena did not flinch. She walked past him, past the broken pews, past the congregation of husks, hollowed out by obedience. She held the prophecy in one hand, a hammer in the other, and she stood before the spiral. It shimmered in her bones, spoke in her marrow. promised her peace. Not peace like sleep, but peace like the end of questions, the end of doubt. The spiral did not want pain. It wanted perfection. A world where memory never dies, because time never moves, because thought is shaped, because freedom is erased. The Reverend turned to her, eyes wide. "You were never meant to read it," he whispered. "You were meant to follow." Elena looked down at the hammer. It pulsed in her grip. Not a tool, not a weapon, but a choice. She remembered her mother, her brother, the fields, the old songs. She remembered what the spiral wanted her to forget, and for a moment, the spiral hesitated. One more turn, one more rotation, and it would complete itself. She raised the hammer. The Reverend screamed, and Billy began to sing. The hammer struck the altar. Once, just once. But the sound was not stone breaking. It was glass, inside the mind, shattering. The chapel screamed. Not the people, not Billy, not the Reverend. The walls screamed. The floor screamed. The air itself tore open in a sound that had no pitch, only pressure. And from the altar burst a wave. Not of light, not fire, but memory. 1,000 voices all at once. Children calling for their mothers, soldiers whispering their final thoughts, a woman reciting the name of her unborn child, the baker crying at his empty table, a man begging forgiveness for things he couldn't forget. Elena collapsed, her mind wide open, her body remembering things she had never lived. She saw the origin of the altar, not built, not found, but birthed in a moment of human betrayal so deep it tore a hole in time. The spiral wasn't a symbol. It was a scar, a record of every lie believed too long, every truth buried beneath shame, every silence that had cost a life. And now, it was all flooding back. The Reverend clutched his head, weeping blood. The husks of the congregation writhed as identity returned in violent pulses, names they had forgotten, faces they had erased, sins they had buried. Billy hovered above the altar, glowing from within. He opened his mouth, but not to speak, to release. A black mist poured from him. It formed figures, 12 of them, men in white robes, the forgotten ones, the 12. Their eyes opened for the first time in decades, empty, terrified, free, and one by one they dissolved, not into dust but into words, etched into the spiral, etched into Elena's mind. Because now she understood. The altar was never meant to be destroyed. It was meant to be remembered, endured, carried. Because every society has an altar, every mind holds a spiral. And some truths do not disappear. They wait. Until someone brave enough swings the hammer, the town began to rot in reverse. Not decay, not collapse, but something far stranger. As if time, memory, and guilt were being rewound. Grass grew where there had been blood. The charred schoolhouse stood upright again, chalk still on the board, the name Blackwood scribbled beneath it. But there were no children, no voices, only echoes of footsteps, shadows of people who no longer lived, moving through routines they didn't remember choosing. The spiral hadn't died. It had spread, through soil, through brick, through blood, and Elelenena felt it in her bones, like a sickness that spoke in forgotten lullabies. She staggered through the streets, past houses that blinked, past lamp posts that leaned inward like they were listening. The Reverend was gone. Billy was gone. But their presence clung to everything. Billy's voice still echoed in the wind. It remembers us because we remember it. She reached the river. It flowed upward, carrying symbols, charcoal gray spirals spinning on its surface, and there, beside the water, was the well, old, covered in vines, but humming. The same well where the first altar stone had been uncovered. The place where the 12 men knelt, where the town's curse had begun. Elelenena looked down into its mouth. No bottom, just reflection. And in it, she saw herself. But not as she was, as she would become. Eyes hollow, skin carved with spiral script, a mouth that spoke in riddles. She looked away, but the image stayed in her mind. The altar had been cracked, yes, but its infection had evolved. It no longer needed blood. It fed on memory. Each time someone recalled the past, each time someone whispered the story, the spiral grew stronger. This wasn't an ending. It was a seed, planted, watered, fed by truth. And now, Cedar Ridge was the garden. And Elelenena, she was the gardener. They came just after sunrise. 3 men in dark coats. Government, journalists, maybe both. They didn't speak to the townsfolk because there were no townsfolk left to speak to. Just empty porches, curtains that moved without wind. A church door hanging open like a mouth mid-scream. The tallest man raised a Geiger counter. It chirped. Not from radiation, but something stranger. "This place has a pulse," he muttered. "Something's still breathing." They moved carefully, stepping over roots that hadn't been there yesterday. Past houses built in the wrong century, past windows that showed scenes from other lives. In one window, a child stood at a blackboard, writing the same sentence again and again: "We must forget to survive." In another, 12 men knelt in white, eyes rolled back, mouths sewn shut. The spiral was on everything now, drawn into the grain of the wood, etched on leaves, burned into clouds. The second man, a skeptic, pulled out his phone. It shattered in his hand. The third man turned and whispered, "It's not just haunted." He pointed to the chapel. "It's aware." Inside, Elelenena waited. Her eyes were darker now, her fingers stained with ink from writing names she didn't know. She no longer remembered how long she'd been here. But she remembered them. The 12. The Reverend. Billy. The altar. She remembered their sins, their songs, their screams, and that memory gave her power. The moment the outsiders crossed the threshold, they forgot why they came, forgot who they were, forgot time. They became characters in the story the altar was still telling. Their faces shifted, their voices echoed wrong. One of them turned to Elelenena and whispered, "I remember being a child here." But I wasn't. Was I? She only smiled. The spiral had taken root in their thoughts, and now it rewrote. Not just them, not just the past, but the Rye rules of reality. Cedar Ridge wasn't cursed anymore. It was alive. A memory parasite. A sacred infection. And anyone who entered became part of it. Forever. In the library, the one that had burned in 1902, a single book reappeared on the shelf. No dust. No binding cracks. Just leather. Black. Veined. And a title written in blood. The 13th will not kneel. Alea opened it with trembling hands. The pages flipped themselves. The script was alive. Not written, but grown. The language was ancient, older than the Bible, older than human breath. She didn't read it. She understood it. It wasn't prophecy. It was invitation, a call to every forgotten town, every soul who'd ever whispered, "What if the stories were true?" The spiral was leaving Cedar Ridge. Not because it was finished, but because it had learned. It now knew how to feed, how to rewrite, how to hide in belief. It didn't need a church anymore. It needed minds, screens, whispers, and the book, that last book, wasn't just history. It was blueprint. She saw visions. A radio host in Detroit who begins reciting verses he doesn't remember learning. A school in Kentucky where children draw spirals with their eyes closed. A therapist in Oregon who starts losing patience and gaining followers. The infection had found its way into memory, and memory was networked, shared, uploaded. It was no longer a town secret. It was becoming faith. Elelynena wept, not from fear, but from clarity. This had never been about Cedar Ridge. It had always been about us. The spiral was the answer to a question buried in every human mind. What do I become when I forget who I am? Now, that answer had a form, a name, a doctrine, and the altar. It no longer needed to be stone. It could be a screen, a voice, a dream, a memory triggered by a story on the internet. The book closed itself, and in the silence, Elelynena whispered the final line aloud. Those who remember, spread it. You're still here. You made it through the fire. The secrets, the symbols, the screaming buried beneath polite silence. But now you must ask yourself, why? Why this story? Why this town? Why 12 men no one remembers, unless you weren't watching. You were remembering. The altar didn't die in Cedar Ridge. It just needed time. Time to grow in the cracks of your attention. Time to rewire how you think about truth. Let me ask you something. Have you ever forgotten where you were going, but somehow still arrived? Ever walked into a room and felt like something was waiting? That's not coincidence. It's inheritance. It's the spiral. And now, it's inside you. It started small. A strange dream. A phrase stuck in your head. A feeling when you looked in the mirror that someone else was watching back. That was the altar reaching out, testing you. Whispering its only sermon. Only the forgotten can be rewritten. You watched the 12 kneel. You saw Elelynena descend. You followed the investigators as they disappeared one by one. But the real question is, why do you feel like you've seen this before? Why do certain names, Fairfax, Blackwood, Thornfield, sound familiar? Because this isn't the first story, it won't be the last, and maybe, just maybe, you were in one of them, a past life, a forgotten memory, a chapter ripped out long ago, now trying to stitch itself back into you. The spiral never needed faith. It needed hosts. Memory is the altar. You are the offering, and by hearing this tale, you've done what the 12 men did not. You touched the altar, and you didn't look away. So if you start dreaming of a chapel that shouldn't exist, if you hear singing in a language you don't know, if your reflection blinks when you don't, then remember, this wasn't just a video, it was a ritual. And now the spiral is in motion. Welcome to the next chapter. You just forgot the beginning.